Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and let's keep week 24 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, for all of Series 3, we've been going back to Tolkien's youth, and off and on at least, the TCBS. Now, often I've been leaning on the incredible research and powerful storytelling of John Garth from his must-read, Tolkien and the Great War. Please, go check out his website, johngarth.co.uk. You can get Tolkien and the Great War there, as well as Tolkien at Exeter College, or the gorgeous The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, last week, we spent most of our time in Carpenter's biography, as Tolkien wrote and starred in a holiday play that was just a bit obvious, and then wrote to Edith only to be given the bad news that she was engaged to another man. We followed along as Ronald persuaded Edith to dump George Field and marry him instead. But how did all this love life interfere with his studies? Garth tells us that a year had passed in which Tolkien continued to neglect his studies in classics, explaining that most of his time and energies were expended on extracurricular activities. He socialized with college friends, spoke in debates, trained with his cavalry squadron, and pored over Eliot's Finnish grammar. Indeed, time was up for Tolkien. After he was reunited with Edith, he had to focus on his honor moderations. Now, not being an Oxford grad, I'm grateful for Carpenter's explanation that these examinations are made up of a number of written papers covering various aspects of the candidate's subject. Now, they're graded from first class down to fourth. Tolkien shoved 4 terms worth of work into 6 weeks, or tried. And when the time came for the beginning of honor mods in late February, Carpenter says he was still poorly prepared for many papers. On the whole, he was relieved when he learnt that he had at least managed to achieve a second class. Here's the thing, though. He only managed that result thanks to his special paper. Now, Garth explains that this special paper gave him the option of studying comparative philology from Joseph Wright, whose Gothic primer had so inspired him as a schoolboy. Old Joe, a giant among philologists, Garth explains, gave him a thorough grounding in Greek and Latin philology. A good thing, it seems, since Tolkien's best paper, something Carpenter describes as a pure alpha, a practically faultless paper, was that special paper on Greek philology. Garth says that Tolkien would have sunk to a dismal third, but for that paper. Fortunately, his classics tutor, Garth says, was broad-minded, with an affection for German culture that disposed him favorably towards the field of philological inquiry that truly interested Tolkien. So he spoke to Tolkien about switching subjects, and as the summer term of 1913 started, Tolkien switched from classics to English. And as Garth puts it, at last, Tolkien was in his element, devoting his studies to the languages and literature that had long stirred his imagination. But over the preceding year, it seems that Tolkien's friendship with his fellow members of the TCBS was fading a bit. He hadn't been involved in the October 1912 play that Christopher Wiseman and Rob Gilson put on at King Edward's. And even though he was in Birmingham at the time of the traditional debate around Christmas, he didn't attend. Garth tells us, though, that at Exeter College, Tolkien had tried to recreate the TCBSian spirit by founding similar clubs. First, the Apollostics, and then the Checkers, which substituted lavish dinners for secret snacks and consisted of his new undergraduate friends. He joined the Dialectical Society and the Essay Club and enjoyed chin-wagging over a pipe. But the focus for the TCBS in the meantime had moved from Birmingham to Cambridge, where Wiseman and Gilson were studying. They were joined by Sidney Barrowclough around the same time that Tolkien changed majors at Exeter. Thankfully, though, Tolkien wouldn't be alone for long. At that same time, Garth tells us, G.B. Smith came up to Oxford to study history at Corpus Christi. Wiseman wrote to Tolkien, "I envy you, Smith, for though we have Barrowclough and Peyton, he is the pick of the bunch." Now, G.B. Smith, Garth tells us, excelled in conversational wit, and he was certainly the most precocious TCBSite, already regarding himself as a poet when he took Vincent Trout's place in the Cabal. He also shared some of Tolkien's heartfelt interests, particularly Welsh language and legend. He admired the original stories of King Arthur and felt that the French troubadours had left these Celtic tales shorn of their native serenity and vigor. End quote. Now, Garth goes on to tell us that things started going downhill a bit for Wiseman. He'd been growing tired of the never-ending banter. Gilson blamed Wiseman's downcast spirits on his inability to continue playing rugby because of an injury. Writing to Tolkien, per Garth, "We have managed to relieve his boredom at times. On Friday, he and I and Tea Cake and the baby all went for a long walk and had tea at a pub. We were all in the best of spirits, not that tea cakes ever fail." In fact, T.K. Barnsley's inimitable spirit could sometimes be a challenge. Garth says that Wiseman wrote to Tolkien saying, "I'm very anxious to breathe again the true TCBS spirit fostered by its Oxford branch. Tea-cake has so fed me lately that I verily believe I shall murder him if he is not altered by next term." And now we come full circle, because Garth brings us back to that December 1913 rugby match that we talked about in the very first Tolkien Tuesday of this series. He writes, "Happily for Wiseman, when most of the old friends were reunited to play their December 1913 rugby match against the King Edward's first 15 a few days later, he was well at the back of the field, and T.K. Barnsley was in the scrum." Probably a good place for him to be to stop annoying him so much. Folks, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday and the Tolkien Tuesdays for Series 3 of the TTT. Now, if after 8 weeks of this series you still don't own a copy of Tolkien and the Great War, take care of that right now by going to johngarth.co.uk. And do consider backing John's future work by supporting him on Steady. I'm proud to do so, and I hope you'll consider it as well. Now, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support this show and get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a lot more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.